Chapter 23, Urogenital System Infections. This is microbiology. We're starting off with a look at the anatomy of the urinary tract. So there aren't too many pieces of it, right? We have our kidneys. The kidneys are going to be filtering our blood all day, every day, and they make urine. And the urine, once it's produced in the kidneys, it will travel down the ureter. So the ureter is a tube that through squeezing, through peristalsis, moves the urine into the bladder. The bladder is a holding tank, right? So it's a storage area. And then the bladder, when it gets full, sends a signal to make you feel like you need to go to the bathroom. And then the urine comes out the urethra. Oops. So the two words I think to keep straight, sometimes students mix up the ureter and the urethra. All right, so just hopefully keep those straight. The kidneys are pretty complicated on the inside. There is a structure called the nephron. The nephron of the kidney is the functional unit. It is what filters the blood. It is what sort of decides what the body should have back, how much water should the body have back, and what actually ends up in the urine. There are parts of this that are not super necessary to know for that, but for this class, but I want you to know that this area here is called Bowman's capsule, and there's a blood vessel inside. There's a capillary network inside called the glomerulus. So this is going to come up. And basically the blood, right, we're going to enter into the little Bowman's capsule. So we have a catchment tank. We have our little capillary system in here, and all of the fluid that's coming from the blood, waste products and different things like that, will get filtered out here, okay? And then the blood will continue out. So this glomerulus is really important. It's basically the filtering membrane of our blood. If you damage the glomerulus, then the ability to filter our blood is really damaged. Okay, in terms of the reproductive system, the male and female reproductive system, let's just talk really quick about structures you'll need to know. For the female, we have a separate urinary system and reproductive system. So there's no overlap, whereas the male, there is an overlap. So here's our bladder and the urethra. So this is the urinary system. And then we have, right, a uterus. The uterus is connected to the vagina. All right. And then we want to know that the entranceway, so the vagina is this tube that comes up, and when you reach the end of the vagina, it's basically the beginning of the uterus. And so the tissue here, or the structure here, is called the cervix. So we'll talk about the cervix and the cervical health, cervical cancer. And then of course the uterus is where, if the woman's pregnant, the baby grows, but this is where the blood comes from, the lining of the uterus with the period every month. Then we have the fallopian tube and the ovary. So the ovary, the structure right here, produces the egg. Okay, and then the next structure that gets the egg when it's made is the fallopian tube. And we'll talk about this a little bit too, that the fallopian tube is a very narrow tube that basically takes the egg when it's produced and it moves the egg towards the uterus. So if that movement is stopped, then the woman is basically not going to be fertile, right? She can't have a baby if you can't have the egg, the fertilized egg, actually reach the uterus. But remember, she has two sides, okay? So one side could be damaged and the other side could be okay. For the male, we have a bladder, right? So this is the urinary bladder. And then the urinary bladder is going to come into this area that creates the urethra. And then what happens is the sperm, because the reproductive system and the urinary system are going to basically share one of the routes out of the body. So the sperm are made in the testes. When the sperm are produced, they go into this structure called the epididymis, and they kind of lie, they mature, and they wait here for ejaculation. Once ejaculation occurs, the sperm will move up into the abdominal cavity, go around the bladder, and then basically come into that same area where the urine is going to leave as well. So the exit from the penis, right, the urethra, is going to be overlapping from urinary and reproductive. So basically, right, if you have an infection of the urethra can also lead to infections of reproductive systems. Whereas in the woman, if you have a urinary infection, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to also have a reproductive issue. So we're going to talk about these infections, bacterial infections of the urinary tract. We're going to talk about a bladder infection. It's called cystitis. We're not going to do lepto. It's pretty rare. Then we have non-gonococcal urethritis and the complications of UTIs. Okay, so here we go. Let's start with our bladder infection or cystitis. And then what's listed beneath that, kidney infections, is like this can lead to this. Okay, so let's take a look. All right, so if you have a bladder infection, which are really, really common in women, it's usually from a normal flora of your large intestine, and the most common guy that causes your UTIs is E. coli. So you can see E. coli in blue is a lion's share of the problems with UTIs. Why is it so common in females? Because the anatomy of our bodies has the opening to the urethra and the anus pretty close together, and the urethra is pretty short. So if we go back to this picture, right, of our anatomy, so this is the anatomy picture. I just wanted to maybe choose a color. So the urethra, right, is pretty short on the woman, and the anus is here. So basically there's a little bit of travel room and then a really short distance to climb into the bladder. Whereas for the male, right, the rectum is here. There is a really long way, and it's also like a detached opening to the urethra. So for bacteria to get from here to here is going to be more difficult than here to here. And the bacteria have all this way to climb into the bladder to make an infection. So one of the things that prevents UTIs is going to the bathroom, just flushing out the bladder and flushing out the urethra. So the time involved for colonization of the bladder for the woman is going to be a lot shorter than the time involved in colonization of the bladder for males. So in that longer time, males probably go to the bathroom a little bit, more than females and have an opportunity to flush out the bacteria. Okay. So, urinary tract infections are basically bladder infections. They're very they become more severe in the elderly, and they do become more common in the elderly because when you are older, the smooth muscle of your bladder just kind of gets weaker, so you don't actually completely empty the bladder. There might be some urine pooling in there, which doesn't get rid of all the bacteria if there are in there. And the elderly have weaker immune systems, so they're vulnerable to infection and also complications. Symptoms are dysuria, which is urination accompanied by burning or discomfort. Pyuria would be pus, and hematuria would be blood in the urine. To diagnose a UTI, it is usually with a dipstick. So a urine dipstick, it looks like this. You give a urine sample, they put in the stick, and it has different chemical analysis areas here. They'll change color based on what's inside your urine. And the two hallmark things that will indicate you have a UTI is nitrites and leukocyte esterase, which are both tests on here. The reason why nitrites is going to be used is because E. coli and Klebsiella pneumonia. Let's look at where Klebsiella pneumonia stands. It is second largest case of UTIs. They both produce that. So they're going to, and which is not going to be found in a healthy urine or someone without a UTI. So they're going to have an enzyme that basically makes nitrite. And so that picks it up. And then these guys also produce leukocyte esterase, the neutrophils in our body produce leukocyte esterase. So if you do have a bladder infection, you're going to have your white blood cells in your urine trying to fight off the infection. And then you can detect those white blood cells by the leukocyte esterase. Protein in blood may also be positive. It's not always positive, but you should never have proteins in your urine, and you should not have red blood cells in your urine. We did this in class, didn't we? So this is a different kind. So we can do the dipstick. This is basically just yes or no. Do I have a UTI? And then this one is what kind of bacteria, right, is causing my UTI. So we can definitively know what's in there. All right, so a UTI that's untreated or a very severe UTI can come up your ureter, right? That's the tube that connects the kidney to the bladder. So the bacteria can actually get in there and go colonize the kidney. There are 2 kidney infections here, and one is related to a UTI and one is not. So this guy, pyelonephritis, is an acute infection, and this is the one where bacteria can climb up the bladder. So E. coli, for example, have come from other parts of the urinary tract, right? So you have a bladder infection, and it causes inflammation of the kidney. So anytime you see itis, right, we know that's inflammation. Nephra refers to the kidney. Pyelo refers to the fact that there's going to be some pus made. So common signs and symptoms include back pain because our kidneys are located in the smalls of our back, fever, nausea, vomiting. Scarring of the kidney can occur after the infection is cleared. That could cause kidney dysfunction. So anytime you have infection that goes to the kidney, it's actually very serious, right? We don't want to have our kidneys be malformed. I just want to show you a picture of the pyelonephritis, right? So the E. coli would come up through the ureter, colonize the kidney tissue, and we have lots of bacteria here. In the next one I'm talking about, it's very different. This is called glomerulonephritis, and it's not related to a UTI. This one is more related to, it is related to an infection. So let's go back to the description. So look at the word glomerulo, right? That refers to that glomerulus, that capillary network inside of our nephrons, and it is inflamed. This can be acute or chronic, and basically we are talking about those capillaries of the nephrons, and they're going to be damaged. The glomerulus, remember, was a very important filter, and once it's sort of eroded or compromised in some way, your kidneys are not going to function normally. We talked about this a little bit before. So the most well-known cause of glomerulonephritis is going to be Streptococcus pyogenes. So remember, this is the guy that causes strep throat, and from strep throat, it can cause scarlet fever, and from scarlet fever, it can cause rheumatic fever and glomerulonephritis. So what happens in glomerulonephritis, it's not the bacteria itself, but the bacteria and our antibodies to the bacteria form an immune complex, and it inserts itself, in the sort of lining of the glomerulus. So let me show you the image, right? So here we have the kidney, and we're looking at that glomerulus area. So the red area in there is going to be the glomerulus. And then we have the image of our little system or aggregation of their antibodies. And then we have our antigen, our green Streptococcus pyogenes. And so when they come together and form this complex, for some reason, it deposits within the glomerulus, basically, the linings of the glomerulus, and it causes inflammation there. So if you have inflammation, you have damage, then what you're going to start seeing is protein in the urine and also blood cells in the urine, because it's going to punch really big holes in your filtration membrane, and those really big objects are able to get out and show up in your urine. All right, so our next disease is called non-gonococcal urethritis. So urethritis is going to be an inflammation of the urethra. And a lot of sexually transmitted infections are classified as urethritis. And so this kind is basically, it is an irritation of the urethra, but it's not caused by Neisseria gonorrhea. So inflammation of the urethra, it's unrelated to Neisseria gonorrhea. And so these bacteria, let's just jump to the bottom, right? So what causes this? It can be Chlamydia trachomatis. And it can also be some normal flora. So Mycoplasma genitalium, Ureaplasma, I haven't said this one out loud, Urolithium, lictum, ticum, and Mycoplasma hominis. So if you have this infection, a lot of times, you guys, sexually transmitted infections and irritation or like infections of the urethra, sometimes they don't have any symptoms and people don't know that they're colonized with a pathogen. So for females, they're mostly asymptomatic, not asymptomatic, asymptomatic. Untreated can lead to reproductive issues. We're going to talk about how is it that if you have a urethra infection that it could lead to reproductive issues. And then for males, it's typically mild, some discharge and dysuria. Remember, dysuria just meant pain and burning with urinating. Okay, so the way most of our sexually transmitted infections are passed from one person to another is from asymptomatic carriers. So if you know you had chlamydia or Neisseria, you know this because you have symptoms and you're going to go get help. You're going to get antibiotics to get rid of it. If you have Neisseria or chlamydia or Mycoplasma genitalium in your body and it's a pathogen, and you're not having any symptoms, you could definitely pass it on to someone else, and they could then have symptoms if they're more susceptible. All right, so our next one here is going to be bacterial vaginitis and vaginosis. So notice we have two endings, itis and osis. So the itis means inflammation of, and the osis is basically no inflammation. Okay, so vaginitis, inflammation of the vagina, vaginosis, no inflammation. So, but there is going to be an abnormal balance of the microbiota. Okay. And so if you remember the vagina has a resident flora. It's going to have, out of the ones you need to know, right? We have this one, Gardnerella vaginalis. That is going to be normal. Lactobacillus is also going to be in there. And we have Candida albicans, the yeast. So what happens in the vagina is if everything's at a healthy level, all the microbes keep each other in balance. If there is an imbalance created, then it can cause one of those types of bacteria or yeast to overgrow. What causes those imbalances can be things like taking antibiotics, or it could be things like being on a certain kind of antimicrobial drug. I mean, not antibiotics, but another kind of drug. It could just be having conditions that cause you to have a yeast infection, for example, is going to cause overgrowth. So being in maybe moist environments for too long can cause the yeast to overgrow. Your diet can also contribute to what is favored to grow inside the vagina. So for vaginosis, all right, we're going to spend most of the time on vaginosis. Vaginosis is asymptomatic, or it can give you mild symptoms. So women may experience discharge. They might experience burning and odor and itching in that area. This is going to be treated with antibiotics. So this is basically the hallmark signs of vaginosis caused by Gardnerella vaginalis. And interestingly, the population of Lactobacillus, right? So we've seen this guy before. Lactobacillus is also used in industries. So there's a lot of species out there, but Lactobacillus is used in food making. So it does help make yogurts and it does help make sourdough bread. So it is basically an acid producer, a lactic acid producer in a low oxygen environment. So this guy sets up the acid, right? This Lactobacillus decreases the vaginal pH. So if you were to increase the vaginal pH, this guy overgrows. Okay. So a change in pH of the vagina going up more basic can cause Gardnerella to overgrow. Clue cells. Let's talk about that. So if you looked at cells in the vagina, if you did a little sampling, of the cervix or the vagina, you would see the epithelial cells of the lining and then covered with the bacteria, the Gardnerella. So that is what we call clue cells. That tells you we have vaginosis. So here are some other real images of clue cells. You can see it just looks very, very grainy because it's completely covered by bacteria, whereas the normal cells look more clear. All right, so coming into gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is a sexually transmitted infection caused by a bacteria called Neisseria gonorrhea. It is in the top 5 of our STDs, and it's only found in humans. So if it's only found in humans, how do we get it passed on from other humans? And normally it's from people who are asymptomatic. So it's a gram-negative Diplococcus. We did look at this guy in lab. And the transmission is going to be from direct contact, mucous membrane to mucous membrane. It does not survive more than 1 to 2 hours on fomites. So this is just telling you that it's pretty weak outside the body. So when you contract Neisseria, most of the time it is very direct contact. Okay, so what makes Neisseria gonorrhea virulent is that it does have fimbria that attaches to your mucous membranes, and interestingly, they have shown that mutants without fimbria cannot cause infection because they have no way of attaching to the mucous membrane. And then because they're gram-negative, they have LPS that can enhance its pathogenicity. But they have a special one. It's called a lipo-oligosaccharide. So it's not lipopolysaccharide, it's lipo-oligo. All that means is that it's a little bit shorter than the poly. This is some epidemiological data for you guys. There's been a lot of cases, right? 2023, 2.4 million cases of syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia were diagnosed. There were 209,000 cases of syphilis, over 600,000 cases of gonorrhea, and over 1.6 million cases of chlamydia. And so that's a lot. That's a lot, guys. So there's also congenital in here. So congenital syphilis and congenital diseases from other ones. So neonatal infant deaths are resulting from these diseases. So this is how gonorrhea can cause infection. So for gonorrhea in males, 10% are asymptomatic, which means 90% of them have symptoms. And the symptom is primarily urethritis, right? So the urethra in the penis gets infected by the bacteria, and it's going to cause an inflammatory response here. So yellowish discharge. And less commonly, because this urethra is attached to the, basically it's like a common area, right? So we can go up and the route up to the bladder is also going to go take a turn, and you can also go towards the testicles. So any infection within the penis can actually move up towards either the bladder or infect the prostate gland, infect some seminal vesicles, or go away down here and infect the testes. So it is possible. And what can cause a infertility to occur is that this pathway, which is really narrow, can build with scar tissue. So you can see that the scar tissue is mentioned here, and it blocks the passageway for sperm. In females, the chronic sign of gonorrhea is going to be PID, but initially the acute form is going to be vaginitis, urethritis, and salpingitis. Salpingitis refers to the inflammation of the fallopian tubes. So the urethra for the female and the vagina opening are very close together. So it is very common that bacteria can go from the urethra, can travel to the vagina, and vagina to the urethra. So we can see that we both have infection of the vagina and we have infection of the urethra at the same time, and this upper reproductive structure, the fallopian tube. So if you look at the picture, if you have an infection within the vagina, it can go into the uterus, and then the uterus has openings to either side. It has openings to those fallopian tubes, and then those fallopian tubes lead to those ovaries. There is a detachment, so there's a break between the end of the fallopian tube and the beginning of the ovary. So a lot of times the infections don't really go to the ovary. They'll just end at the fallopian tube. However, if you don't treat this, it becomes something called pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID. And this can be a mixed anaerobic abdominal infection. It can begin with one bacteria and have more grow. It's very common cause of sterility and ectopic tubal pregnancies because of that narrowing of scar tissue, right? We saw that picture here. We can see it building up here, right? So when you get irritation and inflammation and it's not treated, that normal tissue can become fibrotic, very large and scarred, and it can block the passage of the egg, which I said is going to travel down the fallopian tube this way. So an ectopic pregnancy is basically where the woman, the egg does make it down. I'm sorry. The sperm, the sperm makes it up. Okay. So the egg is a large cell. The large cell gets released into the fallopian tube. The sperm come in and they fertilize the egg. Now, as the fertilized egg travels down the fallopian tube, it should make it to the uterus. However, if you have a very narrow fallopian tube due to the scarring from this infection, the egg sometimes will start to implant into the wall of the fallopian tube and begin to develop, and that's called an ectopic or tubal pregnancy. This is never viable. This needs to be removed, and it can be very dangerous for the woman. In terms of extragenital gonorrheal infections, this is a mucous membrane infectious bacteria. So any mucous membrane is sort of fair game. So we have anal intercourse leading to inflammation of the rectum. Pharyngitis and gingivitis are possible here. We also have conjunctivitis possible here. And then if it does spread through the body, then it can cause other organs. So we have the heart, we have the skin, we have arthritis, which is the joints, and then we have meningitis, which is really dangerous. In newborns, so gonorrhea can be passed to newborns and cause something that we looked at before. So it's a severe form of eye inflammation, and blindness is possible. And again, we covered this in the eyes, but we prevent it from prophylaxis. So if you do have a baby in a hospital, they will always treat the eyes with some antibiotics just in case they don't catch that infection in the birth canal. Okay, we're going to take a pause there.